Hello, welcome. We're getting into a write-up for the Civil War, and I have, let's see, some questions from which you can choose just one to address. I'm just simply asking for a page and a half and citation of at least one source, okay? And just let's jump right into it, okay? So, firstly, be mindful of a possible quiz for this week and in the textbook, and I would highly recommend reading the textbook regardless as a helpful source. And as far as the Civil War breaking out, you'll find plenty of information on the basics of that, the election of 1860, the contested nature of it, Lincoln's public stance against the extension of slavery into the West, and his 7 states seceding and forming the Confederacy under Jefferson Davis. And by the time Fort Sumter episode was finished, there were 11, or shortly thereafter. And the Fort Sumter episode, the Southern states in seceding took hold of all federal properties within their state jurisdictions, and two forts, Fort Pickens and Fort Sumter, both off the coast. Their leaders refused to leave. Their federal military leaders refused to evacuate the posts, despite the demands of the state legislators and the Confederate government for them to do so. So at any rate, Major Robert Anderson, takes a stand, becomes somewhat of a heroic figure in the Northern press on this issue, which was just kind of emblematic because he was a Kentucky slave-owning man who had slaves, was from the indeterminate border states like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri, Delaware, Maryland. It was a very mixed demographic of Southerners and Northerners from the post-war of 1812, like land dispersion. And so the culture there, it was very, very motley. And sometimes not so motley as far as just different regions, different pockets of like East versus Western Tennessee, etc. Between a more Southern demographic, those more tied to cash crop farming, slave-based, and those who were not. So at any rate, it's I don't know, a bit telling, I guess, or emblematic, that it would be a guy whose whose loyalties were ambiguous initially. His patriotism superseded all other sentiments, and he refused Robert Anderson to evacuate Fort Sumter and his men. It was only about 70 men. And so, at any rate, very astutely, James McPherson, the historian, would state, President Lincoln coming in, he refused to give up any properties or territories within any of the states. He had announced that in his first inaugural speech, but he tempered it with an olive branch in telling the southern states that he had not the constitutional right nor the personal inclination to interfere with the institution of slavery anywhere in any bona fide state where it already existed, trying to win them over and trying to get them to, quote, tend to the better side, the better angels of their nature. And so at any rate, he let the South throw the first punch, basically, where he adamantly refused to order the men of Fort Sumter to evacuate, which the Confederate government was demanding. Governor Pickens of South Carolina was demanding. But he also contended that he would not fire the first shot. He would not even reinforce them with military personnel nor any kind of ammunition or arms, but that he was going to give them basic food. And before they could make it there with those provisions, the South decided to give the green light to Pierre Beauregard and the Confederate soldiers to fire upon Fort Sumter. And it was like April 12th through like the 14th of 1861. Didn't last long. After a few days of bombardment, the fort was surrendered. And just like that, Abraham Lincoln is asking for 75,000 volunteers to form an army to keep the 11 states of the South from leaving, from seceding from the country. So at any rate, with number one, I put defend or refute historian James McPherson's claim that the Union's loss at the First Battle of Bull Run was a blessing in disguise. It's a very straightforward and simple argument, as he states, right, that basically, and you find the same similar argument in the very famous Ken Burns. I would highly recommend looking into that. The multiple episodes, but Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War is second to none. But at any rate, as far as just its how popularly known it is and utilized, and how thorough it is, and of course, like any history, it at times, has different slants, etc., to consider. But just factually, getting just a factual background and context to everything, it's incredibly informative. All right, so at any rate, the common argument is that the embarrassing loss at Manassas or Bull Run, remember, D.C. is technically in the South, right? It's in Maryland, next to Baltimore. And so the guys didn't have to go very far down to cross the Maryland border into Virginia and find a junction of railroads that led down into the heart of the South, because it was, trying to take away their infrastructure right away. And that's going to be a common theme throughout the Civil War. And so that's why they went there at Manassas, or the creek known as Bull Run, by the railroad junction. And it started off with very well for the Union, and it took a bad 180. And they're going to ignominiously flee back all the way to the Capitol, all the way back across the Potomac River into Washington, D.C., without any pride, without any order. It was chaotic. People had come to watch it as bystanders. I mean, such was the kind of naivete that approached, that carried into the beginning of the war, that was very thoroughly dispelled by the middle and, of course, by the end of the war. So as far as its barbarity and its tendency to devolve into total war, whereby citizens had to beware of sieges and artillery attacks, and even just personal attacks from soldiers, both sides. So at any rate, after that embarrassment, the common argument is that it sobered the North up and made them realize that they needed to take advantage of their logistical, their statistical advantages. And so again, behind Shelby Foote's multi-volume take on the Civil War, I like to look at Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson. And so in it, he gives this common argument and gives stats as far as the North having 9 times the industrial capacity of the South, 3 times the number of men, just a lot of advantages over the South. And they began to take full advantage of that after the humiliating loss at Bull Run, says this argument. And so you look up, like, for instance, George B. McClellan, who was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first and highly popular leaders of the Union Army, of the 19 northern states that were fighting to keep the South into the Union, right? So the Union Army, also known as the Army of the Potomac River running in through Washington, D.C., right? So at any rate, you find evidence of McClellan just turning this into, I have a quote here from McPherson's book, McClellan forged the Army of the Potomac into a fighting machine second to none. And then on the other side, right, Mary Chestnut, we get a lot of her diary and primary source writings as a source from a Southern wife of a Southern senator and a plantation owner, and I believe it was South Carolina. And her writings are just very lucid, very telling of the times, very articulate and introspective. At any rate, she wrote that that victory for the Confederacy at that initial battle, it lulls us into a fool's paradise of conceit. And so the argument is that the Southerners developed this this like mythology that one Southern soldier was as good as 10 Yankee soldiers, because the idea was as Southerners, to a Southerner, typically toting a gun and via hunting, the kind of martial traditions from the Tidewater region in the colonial period on, that martial culture was much more embedded in the South, military culture, right? And that in the North, that a lot of these people were shopkeepers and laborers at mills and artisans and other types of workers who perhaps had never even touched, much less owned or used a gun prior to this war. And so the South is going to, there's evidence of a very stark contrast between how diligently the North built up its war machine, trained its men, in contrast to the Southern Confederate Army. So you could choose that one as something to think about, okay? And like I said, just a page and a half and at least one cited source. So then contingency, the what ifs of history, right? Like the butterfly effect. If one thing had gone differently, maybe it would have elicited a chain of events that would have sent history in a completely different direction. So the what ifs of history, right? So demonstrate one variable that if that variable had changed, maybe you would have had a different result. And of course, as you know, to this day, the Southern states are part of the Union, and slavery was ended via the 13th Amendment, that the North is going to win. So let's see here. A foreign alliance, particularly with France and Great Britain. The Confederacy was allegedly pretty close at times to forging an alliance with one of them. A larger Southern population, just the what ifs, right? A powerful Confederate Navy, because they call it in the textbook the Anaconda Plan, right? Where the North is going to be able to handle thousands of miles of coastline in the South, by way of having a much stronger, much stronger Navy. And so they're going to kind of cordon off the South, especially they'll do it in sections. So famously, they take the Cumberland and the Tennessee, so the Northwest avenue of getting men and supplies from the Kentucky and Tennessee area is going to be compromised. They take the Mississippi River. When they take Vicksburg, they kind of finish off the Mississippi River and cut the Confederacy east and west in half, and deprive them of a vital route, transportation route there. Of course, the coastline, blockading them with their cotton, going to the English mills, etc., right? Our Navy did a fine job, supposedly, really kind of starving out and isolating and like a python, squeezing the Confederate states and breaking them up through the navigation and control of rivers and the ocean coastline. So let's see here. A victory in some type of battle. And so Antietam. Usually, though, the what-ifs of Antietam are that a lot of times they contend that the North could have really nipped it in the bud early as Antietam, and failed to do so because of the indecisiveness and the timidity of McClellan, okay, arguably. Gettysburg, oh my goodness, Little Round Top. Look up Little Round Top at Gettysburg. And you had a very dramatic battle in which I believe it was day 2 of the 3-day battle there in Pennsylvania. So it was a Confederate invasion of the North, whereby supposedly, especially at Little Round Top, the flanks were almost taken by the Confederate Army, almost broken through. Okay? And so you look at a gentleman, I always forget, I believe he was a professor, and it was the 20th of Maine, the 20th Maine Regiment. You could look them up. But his name was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And he and his men did a desperate bayonet charge when they were virtually out of ammunition to hold on to that flank there at Gettysburg. So what would have happened had they been able to break through? Had they not made the in hindsight, rash and poor decision of Pickett's charge of getting demolished as Southern soldiers trying to attack the middle of the Union lines. So all the what ifs, right? Jubal Early, this guy did a Confederate march to Washington, D.C., and according to sources that I've read, literally the day of the battle, or just the evening before the prospective battle. It didn't ensue. But when Jubal Early was just getting into Washington, D.C. to try to even, take President Lincoln, capture him, the Union forces came just in time to protect the nation's capital, because again, it technically was in the South. And so that was only one of at least a couple occasions in which the South, had they shown a little more speed, a little bit more initiative, they could have taken the capital, and who knows, from there. But of course, even there, it's not the end of your argument, to be honest, or I think subjectively, because look at the capture of many southern cities by the North. They were never synonymous with winning the war. Although I will say, ending the war and bottling up Lee's army and finishing off Joseph Johnston's army was at least correlated, if not in a causation relationship, with the taking of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. So at any rate, right? So look at anything like that and what ifs, if you were to choose number two. These are gentlemen about the time of the battles of Gettysburg. These are Southern soldiers. All right, so let's see here. Number three, how successfully did the, quote, Negro soldiers of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment win respect for and trust in African-American soldiers in the future? After Fort Wagner was fought in the summer of 1863, I believe. There's an old movie called Glory with Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman. This is a true story, obviously, of the 54th Regiment who fought under the son of an abolitionist known as Robert Gould Shaw. And they went on a semi-suicidal frontal attack in South Carolina on Battery Wagner. And they lost easily 40% of their men in that single night's attack. It was just a crazy, like I said, semi-suicidal mission. But word of their bravery spread. You're going to get a Medal of Honor amongst, it might even been two or three, but I know for sure of one, amongst these black soldiers. Such was their tenacity, their fearlessness, and their willingness to die in fighting. And as Frederick Douglass and President Lincoln and others said, the eyes of the nation were on the 54th Regiment to see if African Americans could fight as loyal soldiers. So anyway, look into that. But then you also have to contend with the fact that, okay, even after them, they didn't get the same pay as soldiers. Oftentimes they were not trusted to fight, but they had to do more of the menial work. Some particular leaders, like George Meade, who ran the Army of the Potomac for a while, and then was subsumed to under the position of the leadership of Ulysses Grant, was very not keen at all on the use of African Americans soldiers. But nevertheless, you had easily, I think it was 180,000 at least, African American soldiers who subsequently were used in battle by the Union after this episode with the 54th Regiment. Okay, so something to think about. Then also, and then not to mention the famous quotes with the African Americans. Is remember, you have a famous quote both by Ulysses Grant and by Lincoln, whereby they boast and say that on a more kind of pragmatic way, not anything that was, idealistic or abolitionist like. They said, just imagine what it would do to the South, psychologically, etc., to see 50,000 armed, quote, Negroes marching and going down the Mississippi in blue uniforms, that it would just terrorize and divide and conquer the South. So number 4, should you choose this one? In light of the carnage of the battles of Shiloh and the Wilderness Campaign, and or Grant's directives to Philip Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley and to William Tecumseh Sherman in the Deep South, should present historians revoke the mantle of the war hero from Ulysses S. Grant? He's going to be elected as president, subsequently as a war hero. For many years in court history textbooks, he'll be depicted as such. And there's definitely one romantic facet to his biographies, right? And that is, you very much get data that suggest an underdog story. A lot of evidence being looked over, being seen as being very, just very mediocre in caliber, and with every type of competitive, context that he found himself in, as far as others' observations and evaluations of him. Failure, outright failure, as far as business failures, with money and trying to provide for his family. He quit before he would be possibly court-martialed. He was stationed in Northern California, away from his family, and he got depressed and got into alcohol, and he was publicly seen inebriated. And so his superior wrote him up and planned to have him court-martialed for that. And so him trying to get a position with Lincoln at the beginning of the war, and Lincoln not being interested and not having time to give him much of a meeting, much less give him any kind of meaningful post. And then, of course, you look at Forts Donelson and Fort Henry. And one source I read contended that he was still waiting on permission. Yes, they were planning to have him do this, but he was waiting on permission as far as the time, and he preemptively got tired of waiting and just attacked the first of these 2 forts. And so he hits Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and then he finds himself kind of looking for the Confederate Army along the west coast by the Mississippi, because that was in Tennessee. They stationed him way away from everyone else, from a lot of the key fighting on the East Coast. And so he had a chip on his shoulder. He wanted to prove himself to the world. And so, he begins fighting, and he gets himself surrounded at Shiloh, and his men are just viciously attacked. The number of men who died in a given amount of time was unprecedented in American military history up to that day, when they fought at Shiloh. And supposedly he had multiple subordinates telling him that they ought to consider surrendering by morning. And he famously said, no, tomorrow morning we're going to lick them. We're going to kick their bottom. And what was fortuitous, and he didn't even know, as far as, nothing to gain a sense of optimism from, what he didn't know is Halleck and Buell, who were above him, are going to come and meet and help bail him out at Shiloh. But he didn't even know that, and he still had the tenacity and optimism that basically said no way was he going to surrender the next day, but he was going to fight himself out of that trap. And so, and so then when he goes after Lee, I've seen videos where they try to have him psychologically sublimating his issues with his dad and his brother, being supposedly seen as the one with more promise, etc., and projecting that onto Lee, because Lee, he called him the golden boy. Everyone, both sides, begged Lee to lead their armies. He was a star. You look at Chancellorsville in particular, and his brilliance in that fight. He was constantly outnumbered by the Union Army, and he humiliated one one Army of the Potomac leader after another. And I mean, they just went through many different leaders, and so Irvin McDowell and McClellan and General Burnside and Joseph Hooker, Meade. They just went through quite a few before they got to this gentleman here. And when they tried to court-martial him, his superiors, for fighting without permission, getting in unnecessary trouble at Shiloh, etc., President Lincoln pardons him and says, "I can't spare this man. He fights." He liked his fighting spirit. So you have that kind of tenacity from this quiet nobody who had known so much rejection in his life all the way up to this time here in his 40s. And so it's a nice underdog story. Nevertheless, right, you see in particular when you see the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse connected to the Wilderness Battle, and you'll see that what he wanted to do is wanted to utilize the fact that he had more men to lose and use than Robert E. Lee did, right? So his idea was pretty simple in one respect. This was not his entire strategy, but this was a very common one that he employed and claimed, was that he wanted to hit the enemy on multiple fronts and multiple areas simultaneously, so that he could that in and of itself would make better use of his superior numbers, and Lee would be deprived of his erstwhile privilege of being able to use mobility and saying, okay, I'm keeping these cavalry units, regiments, and these infantry units behind the line, and I'm going to see where the line starts breaking or what side they're going to try to flank us on, and wherever help is needed, I'm moving them to that area, right? And that would supposedly deprive Lee of being able to do that, because in hitting at so many different spots at once, Lee would have to deploy all of his would-be auxiliary troops somewhere. But the thing is he literally had some people underneath him who protested and initially refused to attack, because they said that you have the rifled musket, the rifle basically, invented by the second or third year of the war. And so, easily on-spot accurate for easily 250 yards. And these people are well ensconced behind these earthworks and chopped down trees and 8-foot trenches that they've dug at Spotsylvania Courthouse, etc., and in the wilderness. And it became kind of like later, like World War I with trench warfare, when you have more deadly and accurate weapons and you have people ensconcing themselves behind well-fortified positions, frontal attacks are pretty much suicidal. And so he's going to do that, and he's going to send wave after wave and lose a lot of men. And of course, to some who called him the butcher, they said it wasn't necessary and that it was very callous of him to do that. And then in addition to that is he was very familiar, coming from West Point, with the articles of warfare, right? As far as we do this in my class with World War II, with the latter half of U.S. history, when you get into the Catholic Church and then later the Dutch humanist Hugo Grotius and his works, and notions of just war, right? Reasons for which you fight and the manner by which you fight are to be considered just, and that is going to evolve into international law, right? Where it's not just considered just, it's a question of being legal or illegal. So, this is after the Geneva Accords during the Crimean War, which was before the Civil War, just before it. And so there's already that notion of basic international notions of law and of conduct, of how you fight and do not fight a war. And Grant is going to contend that he's losing so many men and he's unable to chase after the Confederate Army, amongst other reasons, because his supply line is so cumbersome so long, so slow, so vulnerable to cavalry and guerrilla fighting tactics and attacks by the guerrilla fighters like Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson and Mosby, and then not to mention by cavalry units like those of Jeb Stuart and of course probably arguably most famous Stonewall Jackson. So he makes a decision, right, that time is of the essence, that it makes his army too limited regarding mobility and too vulnerable to attack by being dependent upon this clumsy, long supply line. So he says, okay, in isolated points, he's going to say, we're going to no longer rely upon our supply line, and we're going to forage from the southern land itself. And he's going to basically give the okay to two men in particular, to Philip Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, and to William Tecumseh Sherman throughout the South and up the coast of the South. He's going to give them the okay to go and basically pillage what they need as far as supplies and food, etc., from the southern communities. And so that was against notions of just war doctrine and how you are to leave non-combatants alone and their property alone. And so in light of those realities, is it high time that we adhere to revisionist history? That we should no longer consider this guy, the nobody who rose because of his tenacity and his toughness, hero? Should we consider him an anti-model, someone that we should not see as a role model, an American hero in our history books? So please just defend your claims, whatever you say. And remember, it doesn't have to be that thorough. I'm just asking at least a page and a half. All right? And then consider the context of Civil War realities and of what William Tecumseh Sherman experienced. Could and should one defend to any degree the actions of William Tecumseh Sherman and his Union soldiers in the Deep South? Okay? So this guy, William Tecumseh Sherman, as I mentioned in the previous one, this was kind of a right-hand man under Grant for the Union. And when you look back at his biography, you find a lot of ironies, because he's going to be known as being the ruthless destroyer of the South. But when you look at his earlier histories, right, you see vulnerability, you see illness, you see almost a pitiable picture of him up to this point. So, for instance, like Grant, for whom he fought and became personal friends with, and they had a great rapport with each other, he too suffered from depression and alcoholism. Matter of fact, he was removed from command in Kentucky. The Secretary of War, or Secretary, was it the War that was Cameron? It was Edwin Stanton in Lincoln's cabinet, came to visit himself to see for himself just how mentally unstable this guy was allegedly claimed to be. And he agreed with the accusations. He said that he was paranoid, and he wrote a depiction that a lot of present-day historians liken to bipolar disorder. And so he was paranoid, he was neurotic, he was constantly just very morose and constantly super cynical, and that death was coming the next day for him and his soldiers, that everywhere he was placed, he was surrounded by enemies. And of course, that's a little messy, because, him being placed in Kentucky, as I already mentioned, that's a border state that arguably, demographically and culturally, was more southern than northern, and in its origins, and in those who were controlling the institutions of that state. So there might have been some truth to the fact that he was literally surrounded by enemies, being seen as this blue coat Union Yankee in this southern Kentucky state. as their military governor. But he was removed from command. He even, by his own admission, contemplated committing suicide. At one point, he was a stickler for the rules and the laws of nations. And at one famous point, one of his soldiers pilfered into a southern plantation when he was fighting in the South and took a cotton gin, and he confiscated it from his worker. He returned it to the person, and he had that person court-martialed, written up for taking the cotton gin. And Grant is going to throw it out and said he has to worry about bigger fish to fry, and he doesn't have time to have his military tribunals deal with something that's supposedly insignificant. But at any rate, you see evidence when he went into the southern cities, he would go out of his way to write edicts, almost more than any Yankee military leader that traveled through and fought in the South. He was almost constantly writing edicts to the people of every town he came into, etc. And he always was very paternalistic in telling them that if they would come to their senses and accept the benevolent rule of their country, that he would treat them, that he famously said that he would make he himself and his soldiers would share their last cracker, their last ration of food with the civilians of wherever they were stationed at that time. But nevertheless, he also made it very clear that if they continued to rebel against him in the Union Army, if they continued to be defiant, and also mostly to him, if they continued to be devious, right, then they would be punished severely. And so what he began doing, right, you get this picture in his biographies as a man who just almost kind of finally snaps. At the first battle of Bull Run, he saw one of his West Point cadet buddies who was on the other side, who had chosen the South. And he hesitated when he saw him to have his men draw arms against him. And instead, his old buddy didn't hesitate and blew artillery ordnance, into his regiment and killed a lot of his men. His hesitation cost lives. And some of his superiors were aware of that and were not happy with it. And they wrote it down. They had it put against him on his record. And so you see even a sense of timidity in him early in the war. But supposedly, like I said, they contend that circumstances and despondency and depression and alcoholism took their toll on him, and he becomes convinced that the South, that they've been chasing, they tried the tactical way of taking major cities, and that doesn't seem, oftentimes, including in this war, to necessarily amount to too much. They try to chase their army around, but especially being in much smaller numbers on a usual basis, Lee and his men were very adept at using better mobility with those smaller numbers to outmaneuver and stay on the run and hit the Union forces when it was to their advantage to fight. And so that was a frustrating method of trying to fight as well. And so to him, he said it was all about that the war would drag on indeterminately unless the North just simply broke the will, broke socially, the emotional willfulness of Southerners themselves, not just the armed leaders, not just the soldiers, but the Southerners themselves. And the key example of that, right, of his support for that, is he would go into Southern cities and towns and states, and his men would begin to become sniped off their horses and killed, right, by sharpshooters. And there were no soldiers to be seen, and oftentimes. And then he would try to gather the civilians of the city or town together, and of course no one had seen anything and had no information to share. So he began stepping up the ruthlessness with which he began to respond to what he felt was great deviance, great defiance, and also, like I said, just necessitated him beginning to fight against non-combatants and not just soldiers, right? to break the will and to teach a lesson and to deter through fear the Southern people themselves, because he felt convinced, right, that the Southern people were harboring these guerrilla attacks. They were taken in. They knew oftentimes, and they wouldn't rat on their fellow Southerners, especially someone from the same town or city as they were from. And so he began to randomly, by lot, pick civilians in towns, give them a certain number of hours to come forth with any information as to who was sniping his men. And if they had no such information, he would escort them out of the town as prisoners of war, these common civilians. Oftentimes, he would deliberately choose the well-to-do and the prominent people of the towns and put them basically in military prisons and put them to work and working with his soldiers, serving them. And so he was punitive. He also, of course, was known to burn down resources, because the idea was, right, is he wanted to end the Southerners' war-making capacity. And so hence, if he could starve them into submission by burning their crops, if he could burn all of their exports that gave them the money to buy more military, supplies, then he would do that, like bales of cotton, etc., right? And if he had to, with defiant towns, and there were a couple towns that he became famous with. A state where he was most infamous, arguably, was South Carolina, because he purposely and vehemently believed that South Carolina was to blame for the war. Right? They were the first to secede. They kind of led the rebellion out of the country. And so he really kind of gave his soldiers a free hand to pillage and to burn down private houses and take what they wanted from the homes before they burnt them to the ground and burnt down their crops. Now, on paper, he told them he wanted them to take what they needed and to leave with the private civilians of the South at least enough for them to subsist on. Leave them enough that they could live off of and eat from. But that was not carried out, supposedly, in South Carolina. So you have the things, right, the variables of, like, as far as the surrounding context. He was not initially like this at first. And different factors perhaps ought to be considered contextually relevant. His soundness of mind, his depression, his timidity at first, and feeling like his timidity got him nowhere. His experience with Southern treachery, right? Like guerra is war in Spanish, so guerrilla is little warfare, where you don't fight by the rules, and the Southerners oftentimes didn't. And so him facing guerrilla warfare, and the people in the towns and cities of the South that he went through would do nothing to show him any kind of trustworthy sentiments. And not to mention, he was ordered by Grant. He said speed is of the essence, because he was trying to bottle up Lee. And he wanted ORR to go along the coast, so that Lee would have that cut off as Grant was chasing Lee's army. And he wanted Sherman here to cut off the South, the southern coast, and Florida from Lee as well. But he said it's imperative. You have to beat Lee there, or we can't bottle him up. So he was told, right, don't worry about the ordinances of war, the articles of war, live off of and pillage from the Southern people. That was an order that was okayed by his superior, Ulysses Grant. So at any rate, do any of these factors, in your estimation, in any way, I hate to even say, because it sounds almost ridiculous to go so far as say justify this behavior, but does any of it at least give explanation to it, so that at least we ought to qualify our criticism of Sherman and say, well, it ought to be, in fairness, always considered that such and such or such and such, as far as the contextual background to him. All right. So, like I said, please at least a page and a half and one-sided source. Just choose one of these 5 if you're choosing. Okay. Don't read too much into this. I'm not looking for a bona fide research paper in 1 week, and certainly not in just a page and a half or 2. But yeah, if you have any questions, message me, okay? And I look forward to seeing what you write. All right? So take care.